I love that idea of digging deeply, taking the deep dive into a writer via this act of translation. I feel like it's something that we've left a little bit behind. One doesn't hear quite as frequently about these sorts of projects. But they weren't at all uncommon until fairly recently. This idea that I'm going to read this by translating it seems like a pretty powerful gesture.
Well, I started off also really loving Russian writers, and one of the things that happened once the Stalin regime took over was that though they couldn't write their own work, they could in fact translate other people's works. Mm-hmm. And so there's something of the experiment with language, but also getting out that creativity in a different way that I think is really, really great. I mean, you translate as well. I think there's something fascinating about trying to make precise, but it's also part of the reason why I love to travel to places where I can't speak the language is I always feel afterwards that I'm more in touch with the English language. So I spent a year in Berlin trying to learn German and felt that what actually happened was I've got closer and closer to the English language, which was great. Yeah.
I feel like Gertrude Stein sort of had that as part of her, internal brief, that she would surround herself with a language that wasn't hers in order to work on this unusual wrangling that she did with English.
Well, what's wonderful about her is sometimes you wonder about her English.
She's
using it in such an unusual way. You're like, wow.
Yeah, absolutely. Just to push a little bit more with poetry, I mean, it's actually where I wanted to start the conversation about fiction and its discontents, is with poetry, because you do have this long-standing, it seems to me, engagement with poetry in different ways. And
I do.
The novel Days by Moonlight involves a search for, it's sort of à la recherche d'un poète perdu,
yes,
right? This missing poet.
Yes.
And so I just wonder how it's informed your work and your thinking and all of that.
Okay, so when I was around 8 or 9, my mother, who was a fanatic for certain kinds of English poetry, she loves, the Elegy on a Country Churchyard, and she was crazy about Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner. And she tried to get my sisters to sit on her knee while she was reading these things, and they wouldn't. And when I asked her why she read it to me, she said, "You were the only one that would sit down and listen to it." And so there's something, it's a weird thing to say, but there's something utterly maternal about poetry to me. It's my relationship to my mother. And so in a sense, when I've written a novel in which somebody is searching for a poet, a lost poet, it's searching for, that voice, that closeness, the intimacy of somebody reading. There is an ancient mariner and he stopped with one of three, and so poetry for me is essentially something that my mother introduced me to. And one of the biggest frustrations of my life is that I'm such an awful poet that I wish that I could be a poet and tried for a long time. But it was always so stressful because I was really aware that I wasn't any good at it, whereas I didn't care whether I was any good at prose or not. And so I was able to do it, and I was able to get beyond being bad at it, whereas I've never been able to get beyond being bad at poetry.
That's interesting that you say that, because I too wanted to be a poet. To me, this was the thing that one should aspire to, and also was just lamentable at it. Just produced these sort of awful things, but fairly quickly got the transmission sternly that they were awful things, and that I best till other fields.
Did you actually show people? Because I didn't.
I just knew it was bad. Confess that I sent a few things off to magazines with the zeal of first passion, and was told in no uncertain terms that I should think of doing something else.
Okay, so I realized I just lied to you. It's a bold-faced lie. So one of the things about poetry is one of my best friends is Rube Orson, a really great poet. And she said something to me that kind of unlocked poetry a little bit. She said that she would write a poem, and then put it in a desk drawer, and then she might write another, put it in a desk drawer, and then at some point she would like pick up all these things and collate, and maybe a line from this poem was okay, and maybe a line from there was usable, and from that collation she could sometimes get a poem. And what that did for me was that it taught me that in a way it doesn't have to be pristine. I don't have to be Wallace Stevens on my first draft, which was what kind of frustrated me for the longest time, that I just couldn't get my idea of poetry down in early drafts. When she said that to me, and I realized that it was possible to just put this stuff away and let it grow, and that you could work on it and learn how to edit poetry, I started to write it. And my favorite publication of mine, I submitted 3 of my poems anonymously under the name of, what was it, Ismail Anderson, to Contemporary Verse, a Canadian publisher of poetry, and they accepted it and gave me $50. That's my favorite $50, because it was nothing to do with me, it was just the work, you know, and so it meant that I had sort of like passed a little bit of a hump of getting poetry published.
I had that's reminding me that I had a poem published by my favorite magazine many years ago called Sulphur magazine. Some of you may know it.
Diabolical.
Had a very particular editor, let's say, who was one of these people who was scoldy and rejection. But I got a poem in. It was a 3-line poem. And I was so excited about this. And when I got the proofs, I saw that my name had been listed as Leigh Hunt, who, of course, was Keats, friend of John Keats, a well-known romantic poet. Indeed, to this day, if you look in one of the final issues of Sulphur magazine, you'll see that Leigh Hunt has a very short poem.
Do you remember the 3 lines?
I think I won't say them aloud, but perhaps later privately. I said them aloud once rather proudly to a poet friend, and she said, "God, that's awful." So I just get it from all directions when I try with the poetry stuff.
My favorite is from my friend Joan McLeod, who's a playwright. So this playwriting poetry thing is a little weird, but she started off wanting to be a poet, and she told me one of her poems from when she was 14, and I've never forgotten it, and it's only 2 lines. "You call yourselves parents, I call you prison." That's a step up from my contribution, or I should say Leigh Hunt's contribution. That's a serious step up. But I mean, it does everything poetry is supposed to do, so I think it's wonderful.
Yes. Yeah, and my last thing to close my side of this poetry thing is my actual first publication was a haiku. So I say this partly because I'm interested in thinking about these modes of compression. To me, this was part of what was interesting about being a serious reader of poetry, was this extraordinary concision that seemed available. I'm not trying to be reductive about the various possibilities of what poetry can do, but I was particularly attracted to a very compressed, calipered notion of language. And reading your work, I feel that kind of sense of care around the shape of a sentence as we move through your work.
Yeah, although I was talking with Abby, who's a playwright, and talking about the antagonism between poets and playwrights. But what I love, or what I think is close between poets and playwrights, is not so much the surface of the language. It's that they both have a kind of instinct for what you can leave out. And that one of the problems for a prose writer, a novelist that tries to write theater, is not knowing what to leave out. And so I think it makes sense that Bertolt Brecht is a good poet and a good playwright, because the concision and the knowing what to leave out is very definitely part of that aesthetic. Whereas I think for us as storytellers, it's hard to know what to leave out. And so that's why I would sort of say, well, on the surface, I hope my work isn't poetic as in flowery or, searching for obscurities to impress the reader, but that it has a kind of concision that I aim for. And it probably comes from being introduced to literature through poetry.
Well, it makes me think of the 5 volumes in the cycle they're all relatively short.
Yeah.
And yet what they build to, the 5, builds out to something that's quite robust in terms of length, and certainly in terms of vision. So I'm curious if that was a deliberate strategy. I'm going to take these smaller bits and build into something, or did it happen along the way?
It was deliberate, and in order to talk about it, I have to talk about how much I am influenced by the Oulipo, the Ouvroir de Littérature Potentielle. It is a French group that tried to combine mathematics and literature. It was founded by François Le Lyonnais and Raymond Queneau, and I was actually a close friend of an American proponent of it named Harry Matthews. Harry was really wonderful to me in life. He died in 2017. And what happened with the Oulipo and thinking about mathematical structure is that in the end I learned to read fiction with an eye to what is underground. When you start to look at, so Oulipian techniques would be, for instance, Georges Perec writing an entire novel without the letter E, or Italo Calvino using a text in logic as the basis for Mr. Palomar, where he's using. I don't know if you know that. That's a really great one. And it also teaches you to read literature differently when you're looking for echoes, and not echoes in terms of rhyme, but echoes in terms of psychological echo. So in chapter 1, there's vanilla, and then in chapter 2, there's a flower that looks like a vanilla flower, and so on and so forth. When you're looking for what's subterranean, it also teaches you in your writing to kind of segregate those two and play with those two. And so when it came to wanting to do the quincunx, a quincunx is an arrangement of 5 elements with 1 element on each corner and 1 thing in the middle. And Thomas Brown thought of it as the arrangement of flowers in the Garden of Eden. It's the perfect form. And so I could play with that, and I could, throughout the 5 novels, there are groups of 5 that keep reappearing. In fact, in the first novel, there are 5 elements: bread, sheep, candles, I can't remember, and they're varied all the way through the 5 chapters in different orders. And so it's musical, but it's also very much learned from thinking about structure mathematically and differently. So the whole project actually comes from my love of the Oulipo, my love of Harry Matthews, and my sense of what literature can do as an abstract art form, as opposed to just storytelling, which is in fact a kind of drama for me, or a kind of contradiction, because part of my love of literature comes from my love of storytelling, and I feel like the Oulipo has made me in some ways betray the storytelling elements. But I think in the quincunx I'm trying to get both together.
I want to come back to the storytelling dilemma that you face, because I find that really interesting. I do have to say, so I suspect we'll just continue to find commonalities. I became quite close to Harry Matthews late in his life as well.
No, I didn't know.
And also found him tremendously inspirational in all sorts of ways, and encouraging.
So let me tell a quick story about
please.
Harry Matthews. I was talking to him on the phone once, and I swear to you, I made no mention of my situation or whatnot. My situation was that previously I had not paid taxes, and I had sat down with my mother, who insisted that we would do my taxes and get me okay with the government. And at one point while I was doing those taxes, she started to giggle, and I was like, "Mom, what's wrong?" I had made $5,000. She wondered how a person could live on $5,000 for a year, but that was it. But during that year, interestingly enough, I was talking to Harry, and he asked me if I was okay. I said, "Yeah, I'm fine. It's fine. Everything's okay." He said, I feel like you need some money." that's a weird thing to say to somebody. But I said, no, I've taken so much from you, it would be horrible to take. And he said, no, I actually do think that you need money. I said, fine, I've got $10,000 coming at the end of the year. I would love to borrow, say $5,000 until then. He said, I refuse to lend it to you because that ruins friendships. He sent me the next day a check for $5,000, which was tremendously helpful. I was writing 15 Dogs at the time. And so it was just tremendously generous. And I think he just genuinely liked my work. I mean, he was friendly with me, but I think he genuinely liked my work, and so I think he's tremendous.
That story absolutely rhymes with my experience with Harry Matthews and the kinds of gestures and the kinds of care he would take. And then, mind you, this was a writer who had done extraordinary work in his life. Yes. And I remember one of the last conversations I had with him, I was assuring him that in fact there were young writers who were interested in his work. And he rather didn't believe it. And I insisted, and he said, well, I wish every once in a while they'd send me a postcard and tell me that. Yeah. And so I said, Harry, may I give your address to young writers? And so a group of young writers for the next some years until he passed would send,
or
told me they sent
That's
postcards.
That's lovely.
To him. And so just note to all of us, every once in a while let that person know that you care about them.
That's really lovely.
Yeah. But so you said something interesting to stay with the Oulipo before we go to the storytelling. You've said, and I think I have a note about it, that it's really not and you've said as much already this afternoon, it's not the output of the Oulipo that has so amazed you, and which has always been the case for me as well, generally speaking. The artifacts of the Oulipo are often not nearly as interesting as the mechanisms or perhaps the undercurrents that Andre has been talking about. But you said something that I found quite interesting. So what does interest me is the notion of things buried beneath the surface, in part because hidden form is the classic argument for the existence of God. Which might, go back to that wrestling with Catholicism and other things. But I haven't heard of someone articulate an interest in the Oulipo by evoking this kind of notion of a proof of the existence of God. I'm just interested in that.
So I had that conversation with Harry, in fact. So for me, I'm not a believer. I'm an agnostic. Although I always say that I'm a Catholic agnostic, in that the God whose existence I'm unsure of is the Catholic God. So I don't know what it would be like to be unsure of Krishna or whatnot, but the guy with the beard I'm not sure about. But for me, of course, the classic argument about the gardener, you see order, and from that order you can infer that someone has created that order, and that the world being ordered, therefore, there must have been someone who is at the heart of that order, thus God exists. I don't believe that for a second, but I love the imagination that comes up with that. And when you think of the Oulipo and having underlying structure. So on the surface, you're talking about a love story, but then you start to notice, well, this reappears, and that reappears. And wait a second, this rhythm is absolutely programmatic. So when you notice that there is an order that subtends a work, then it kind of echoes the kind of Gardner argument for the existence of God. And I asked Harry, it feels almost as if when you have deeper abstract structures like that you are in some ways presenting the public with a version of the argument of the organized gardener thing. And he said that he believed it, although he insisted that although Raymond Queneau was absolutely a believer, and so he would believe it at that, there were many Oulipian writers who were non-believers or atheists, and so he wasn't sure whether they would share in that. But he was a believer, and so he was kind of intrigued by that idea that you're echoing an argument of the kind of deeper significance of deep structure.
Oh, I love that. Yeah. That's wonderful. And for some reason, as you were describing that conversation with Harry, I was reminded, and not to get too anecdotal about all this, but our family took a pandemic road trip to Florida, and I insisted that we push on to Key West, partly to pay homage to the place where Harry Matthews had spent important parts of his life, all for many years. And I partnered up with the poet Eleni Sakelianos, and I thought we'd just take a drive-by, because I had his address, because I had sent postcards to it. I thought we'd just take a drive-by and sort of, nod in the direction of the door, of Harry's door. Eleni jumped out of the car and said, let's see if anybody's home, and banged on the door. And Marie Schex, Harry Matthews' widow, came to the door and opened the door, and pretty soon Eleni was beckoning me as I was sort of hiding in the car, and had a very nice visit. And what I was thinking of, and this idea of these things that bubble up in different ways and organize, still hanging by the front door are Harry's hats. There are still hats by the front door in Key West.
So I visited him there, and I stayed at his house there for 3 days, and they had bought the house behind. He was very wealthy.
Yes.
They had bought the house behind it and made a pool in between the two houses and whatnot. But my last memory of him is inviting me to leave the premises because he used to bathe naked in the pool there, which I didn't need to see. That's one of my last memories of Harry.
Yeah. Oh, it's so nice to have that in common. I'm still writing postcards in my mind to Harry Matthews, and probably will be for the duration. So I'd love to talk a little bit about this, because we exchanged a bit around this notion of this dilemma around storytelling, right? And so what you come out of as a writer, sort of your deep roots, your deep well, and then coming into some conflict with the ways it's manifested in the world. I'd love to hear a little bit more about that.
So I think people may know there's a famous essay by Walter Benjamin called The Storyteller. And in it, he talks about the work of the Russian writer...
Leskov.
Yes, Nikolai Leskov. And in describing the storyteller, he starts by describing a person who has visited foreign lands and then comes back and tells people about these visits. And there's something about death and foreignness that is at the heart of storytelling. And that essay bugs me for that moment in which he's talking about this person sitting around a campfire talking to members of a village who don't travel. It bothers me because when we talk about storytelling of that nature, we're in fact talking about the theatrical. When somebody is in front of a group of people and telling them their experience, it is theatrics. They'll try to please. If somebody laughs, they'll go towards it, and they react to the audience around them. You don't have that when you're writing a novel. You don't have that when you're writing a short story. And there is a difference in kind between what happens when you're in front of a group of people and what happens when you're in front of a piece of paper. That said, being in front of a piece of paper is the constant effort to recreate the scene in which you're in front of a group of people, to make some theoretical group happy, to make some theoretical group interested in what's going to happen next. So I'm really aware of the impulse to please that campfire, but aware also that it's not like that. That there isn't that immediacy, but that if I'm successful, I can create the illusion of that immediacy. What's a bit odd for me is that I do believe that, and that is at the origin of what I think about storytelling. But in loving mathematical structure, I've gone absolutely to the other end of that and embraced pen and paper as opposed to fireplace and smoke. And seeing those two different kind of forms, I think a lot about how you combine them, how you bring them together, and how you can use pen and paper to recreate fire and smoke. Or how fire and smoke sometimes uses pen and paper, because I remember I was part, a long time ago, of a group of storytellers and had to write stuff that was 2 minutes long, 5 minutes long, and speak it without looking at it, just like speaking my work. And that was really interesting because I was actually speaking from the page and the pen, but trying to recreate that other side.
Wow.
Yeah. So it was really interesting.
Yeah.
I suppose it's why I'm very aware of the difference between what happens when you're telling a story and what happens when you're writing a story. They take different muscles. They're not completely unrelated, but it's different muscles.
Absolutely. Did you have any signal early storytellers in your family? Was,
My
in
father.
addition to poetry, was your mother good at telling stories?
So my father.
Yeah.
My mother was okay at telling stories, but my father was the one.
Yeah.
And I would, one of my primal memories is forcing the poor guy to tell me the same story over and over of the monkey tricking the alligator. It's just, for some reason, I was obsessed with that.
Yeah.
And I couldn't get enough of it. So that's kind of my father.
I had a father who sang stories to us.
Nice.
And yet they were sort of, in retrospect, they were sort of long, rambling, improvised, I say and yet, but just thinking about this, the way one then shapes something later on, that were sort of strung together with repetition and favorite moments.
Yeah.
And apart from that, though, I come from a tradition of sort of non-storytellers, big talkers, but not people who told stories with their talking, which is a difference.
Yeah, that's a different thing too.
Yeah.
But I love the talkers at the table too. Can you remember my uncle getting drunk and trying to prove that drinking did not make him a bad driver? That he knew his own level of alcohol, and therefore the government's .08 was meaningless because he knew when he couldn't drive, the government did not. That's like typical like Trini conversation around a table for me.
It's making me think of a writer I love very much and who perhaps you know personally, Michael Ondaatje.
I do.
And his memoir,
Running in the Family.
Running in the Family, which is bursting with this kind of table talk. You could imagine someone at his table making a similar sort of an
That's my
argument.
favorite of his books.
Yeah. I still return to that one. And for me also, I look at Coming Through Slaughter and the collected works of Billy the Kid, right? Those very early works that, we return to poetry that are informed by his very, serious practice as a poet, where he's starting to move into some other way of articulating things.
Do you know what's interesting? I was talking to Abby about this, and talking about how, for me, Canadian literature is essentially literature written by women. That when I was growing up, all the novelists and short story writers that were any good were female. So Alice Munro, Margaret Atwood, Margaret Havison, the poet, it was a model. But what's also interesting about that was that the prose writers that were good, with Alice Munro being a kind of exception, were also really good poets. So it's kind of interesting to have that connection.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you have a connection to the literary magazine Brick?
I did, yeah.
Yeah.
They're good.
Just thinking of that sort of constellation that has been very interesting to me to look at. It's obviously it's not Canada exclusive, but it's a wonderful, long-standing literary magazine based there that Ondaatje and others had a hand in.
You studied it, yeah.
Yeah, had a hand in forming. Yeah, absolutely. Let's switch for a minute. Switch gears. I'm interested in. I'd love to talk about animals for a moment. And something you said in your interview for the recent story, so the story that's published by Andre not too long ago in the New Yorker, and which you can read online, and you can see the interview that I'm referring to. But there was a lovely moment that felt very illuminating to me, and that seemed to me to speak more broadly to your works. You're asked by the interviewer, I think sort of in good faith, as one does, have you yourself spent a lot of time around horses? And your answer was, no, not really. And so this is a story about a talking horse, right? And about grief and about mourning, perhaps much more so than about the talking horse. And I was interested in that because that seems to have become almost a sort of indispensable element in any sort of conversation these days is, have you done this thing yourself? Do you have deep, direct knowledge of this thing yourself? And I just thought that it was a lovely moment of absurdity. It's about there's this talking horse, and have you spent time around horses? And I'm sure it wasn't asked in that way, sort of passing the time kind of question. But it felt like, your works, which go into anywhere you want to go, it seems to me. And there are thinking and talking animals in your work. There are things that enact kinds of magic, etc. This sort of question, you could imagine a whole line of them. And have you done this? And have you done this sort of thing? No, not really, being the answer all along the line. And I'd love to hear you talk a little bit, whatever comes loose with that.
Okay, so that story, I really, really didn't want to write it. As soon as I knew the damned horse would talk, I thought, great, I've had a novel of talking horses, so I'm the Dr. Dolittle of Canadian literature. And one of my friends, after he read a draft of Windham, said, is it gerbils next? It's like, honestly, it was really, really, really annoying. And I almost didn't publish it. It starts in my inability to write about my father, my inability to write about that grief, and then finding this way to do it, and then being disappointed that I had to use the horse to convey this stuff. But my friend Aru actually said she really loved it. It was the favorite thing of hers that I had written, and so I persisted. I do, it's funny. My favorite Grimm's fairy tale is The Bremen's Town Musician, which is another thing that I read over and over again. And so I guess the animal talking thing or the animal thinking thing comes from story. But it was very frustrating doing that story as a result of feeling like I was going back to a well that I thought I had exhausted. But I don't know. There was also something Swiftian about it. There was also a chance to revisit an image from Gulliver's Travels, where he has come home at the end, and he can't stand his family, but he can stand the horse, which he takes for being a Windham. And of course, the horse has, I'm sure, no idea what he's talking about. But he spends all these hours in the stable talking to this horse, and that image was actually deeply effective for me. And so it's weird that an image of a story about grief should be inspired by the image of a father not being with the family and talking to a horse. It's kind of when you think about it in retrospect, it makes total sense. But I didn't really understand what I was doing until much, much later. Right? But,
I love that little wobble of not being quite certain whether or not the horse understood or not. In your expression, there's something really lovely about that. We don't quite know.
I do also feel like in that story, it is very unclear. It was unclear for me while I was writing it, and it's still unclear whether the horse talks at all.
Yes, of course.
He's grieving, and for me, grief is a hallucinatory drug. And so what you're participating in when you're reading that story is potentially a hallucination, a delusion brought on by grief. And then anybody that's lost a parent, it's the same thing. The world just doesn't function in the same way. It doesn't feel the same way. It doesn't look the same way. And I wanted to be able to talk about the kind of drug that grief is, which is also at the heart of Days by Moonlight. So there's an echo between those two, which is another novel.
Yeah, absolutely. First I'll have to just let you know that I played the donkey in my first grade theatrical rendition of the Bremen-Town Musicians.
Nice.
So I've had that one in my back pocket for a good while as well. But I have to say, one of the things I loved about the story was that you absolutely make available the reading that you just described, whether the horse is speaking or not, ultimately becomes rather not beside the point isn't quite the way to put it, but it's not the central gesture. We have that, we can read it either way. And other ways.
Yes.
and you do not do us the disservice or the discourtesy of, at the end, sort of letting us know, right? No one really vets this. Yes, the mother has things to say, but no one really vets this from the outside, what is happening. And that gives it a kind of power, for me at least.
Or takes away power, because I think one of the things that people, if they're inclined to criticize my work, can criticize it for being cold, for refusing to make the gesture in one way or the other. I feel that if a book is a small community, writer, book, and reader, all three of whom are alive, and that the thing, the society that is formed during the reading of a book isn't all about the writer. It isn't all about the book. It isn't all about the reader. And so part of me is really reluctant to try to reach across the words to force the person who's reading to see things my way. But the more you do that, the less it feels like you've invested a deep emotional thing. Whereas I don't think that that's true. I hope that in taking away some of the emotion, I allow the reader to put in their own and share the experience. But some people will and some people won't.
Yeah. And you mentioned Days by Moonlight in this context. I found that so that there are levels of loss and of grieving within this novel, and indeed it carries that accumulating, for me, charge of emotion, because it doesn't wear it all on its sleeve. We don't go in sort of guns blazing with grief. And it makes me think of something that I was going to go at from a slightly different direction. I was rereading, but it was so long ago that I first read it that it's really just reading, I have to say, Erich Auerbach's Mimesis, this long study on portrayals of reality, right? Which I'm sure a number of you have encountered. And I was reading in the section of the opening section on the Odyssey. He said something in passing that I found intriguing, because I was discovering your work. He talks about how Homer in the Odyssey does not build the sort of emotion around suspense that other works might. Because you'll be going along, if you've encountered, say, the Odyssey recently, you'll be going along, and there'll be also, is Odysseus going to get home? Is he going to get home? Is he going to get to Penelope? All these sorts of things. But then there'll be something that goes off to the side, right? We'll stop everything and go entirely into this new moment of backstory that forgets, to a large extent, where we just were, right? It doesn't constantly call out the fact that Odysseus was listening to this story, but he had his mind on getting home. It doesn't do that. We stop and we go into that moment, and then we return to the frame that we have stepped out of. George Perec does this in Life, a User's Manual. Harry Matthews does this to a certain extent in his works. And you do this to a certain extent as well, right? In Days by Moonlight, there's this wonderful, we are now going to hear a story within the story, and we do not need to be reminded as that story within the story is being told that there are these other things happening around us. We will return to that. Whereas another kind of writer would constantly need to remind us, get in the grief, get in the suspense. And so by the end of the novel, it isn't used up for me in your work I'm talking about. There is this real accumulation that has been just generally slowly paid out.
So that comes from one of the things that I adore most in literature, which is The Thousand Nights and a Night. 1001 Nights is, for me, it's a treasure trove. And the stories within stories within stories are wonderful. But there's also a novel which people don't tend to know, which I totally adore. It's called Manuscript Found in Saragossa, and it's by Jan Potocki. And not only are there stories within stories within stories, but even within the stories, some will say, what story are we on? and express the kind of confusion that people will be feeling while reading the novel. It's fantastic. It's fantastic. There was a movie made of it. I don't know if you know it. The setup is this guy is going through this horrible valley, and they have to spend the night not far from two hanged men, and they go to this inn, and then in the morning they wake up beneath the hanged man, and that happened several times. So that gets me.
Absolutely. Oh, that's fabulous. Yeah, there's a terrific book, or at least that I enjoyed quite a bit, called Three Rings by Daniel Mendelsohn, that explores Auerbach, that explores W.G. Sebald and others, and this notion of rings, of stories within stories that don't necessarily have direct impact on what happens. It's not a cause and effect, it's a paratactic effect that builds over time.
Yeah.
And that's the experience I've had in reading your work. And to me, again, that makes it very powerful.
Thank you. I'm glad.
Yeah.
Mostly it's like, I don't know Harry Matthews, and you both speak so lovingly of him. What is it about his work that moves both of you?
Well, what is it about Harry's work that moves me? It's humor. He's very funny. And I respond to funny quickly. It's the thing that I adore. But it's also, it's wickedness. It's funny, but it's doing things that you're not quite sure of. So there's the being dislodged, which I really like and which some people don't like. And I feel within him that something is being told to me that I don't understand, but I'm willing to go with that. And I feel that as a kind of wonderful mystery as opposed to a frustration. I really like that feeling. And to some extent, I would like to think that my work can accomplish that at its best, where you're feeling, okay, I know something is going on here. I don't know what it is, but I can feel that something is going on. And he told me a story, this is the Harry Matthews night, I guess. He told me a story about his encounter, one of his early encounters with Marie Schex, whom he married. And he was translating her work, and she was married at the time, and he really had a thing for her, but he felt it was inappropriate. But he sat down and he wrote this passionate love letter to her, and then realized that he couldn't do this to this woman. And so he kept the letter because it was about translation, and so he kept all of those things, but took out all the things that were about his emotions that he was feeling. And he told me that when she received the letter, she had a hard time not jumping on a train to go and see him, because what had been taken away was still in fact there, despite it having been pulled out of the letter. And I asked her personally whether that was true, and she said yes, it was really difficult not to go for the guy. And I sort of feel that's what it is for me with Harry. I don't know what quite is there. It's not love, it's not desire, but it's something. But I feel it, and I hope that I can convey that with my work. There's something deeper, and that when you read the things more than once, you begin to penetrate into the mystery of the text. And his text can be read a lot of times, which I adore. Cigarettes, I would say. Start with cigarettes. Although my favorite is Toulouse, because that's the one that I read first. T-L-O-O-T-H. It's a mispronunciation of tooth or truth. You don't know.
Or sleuth.
Or
There's
sleuth.
a little bit of sleuth in there as well. Yeah. And I'll simply sort of sign on to everything that Andrea just said so beautifully. And then maybe also just add that Harry was, for me, one of the great embodiments of Italo Calvino's notions in his 6 memos for the next millennium around lightness and quickness, right? A kind of ability, not slightness in terms of lightness, but that ability in the face of darkness, of difficulty, to vault over the tomb, as it were. And then also that notion of quickness, of speediness. The work gallops when it really hits its stride, especially in the early things like Conversions and Toulouse and others. And then the last thing, a very different book that got quite a bit of acclaim that he wasn't unhappy about, I think, fairly, was My Life in CIA, which came out later. And he and I actually bonded over our people thought that he was in the CIA when he wasn't at all. And I was recruited by the CIA, and for a long time, people, including the poet Bernadette Mayer, believed I was in the CIA because I worked at the United Nations. And so we had a great initial conversation around that. But I offer that anecdote in part because he had this wide-ranging experience and was playful right up until the end.
Yeah, it was playful.
Andre, I know that you said that you spent a year in Berlin, and I don't know if your work has been translated into German. Do you think that you would have someone translate your work into German, or would you do your own work into German, and would it change if you were doing the work, kind of like a work in progress in another language?
So I've refused to translate my work into French. I know French well enough that I could translate it, but my French is a French from when I learned it as a child and then from books. But it's not that keeps me from translating my own work. I could do it. It's that it took me that much time to put it into English. And to find the equivalent of it in French is not just by finding a word-for-word substitution. It's having to go through and thinking about how I would feel emotion X when it's expressed in a different language. So it's not a process that I want to go through again, because largely, I don't know how it is for other people, but for me, once the work is done, I'm glad it's done, and I'm happy, and I'm onto something else. And so the thought of having to go back, revisit those feelings, and then find equivalents to them in a different language, that's my idea of what happens in hell. So no, I really don't want to do that. It would almost be fun to do it in German because I don't know German well enough to do it. And so that would be kind of the amusing thing, like I'd be doing like this impossible crossword. So if I were likely to translate any of my works into a language, it would be into German, but it would be horrible.
Thanks, both of you guys. So not to completely continue the Harry Matthews geek out, but one of my favorite Harry Matthews images is he has this discussion about form where he talks about, people think of form as this constraint, you think of, I think it's you think of a soccer field, right? And people think of form as the lines you draw around the field, when in fact what gives soccer meaning is the set of rules by which the game is played. And so that is the way that he thought of his form. It's not as this thing that constrains, but rather as something that animates. And I think one of the reasons I thought that the two of you guys would be great in conversation together, and I want to hear what you have to say about this, Laird, as well, is that both of you are really interested in genre. And you both, Laird, you work with historical fiction, you work with science fiction, you work with horror. Andre, your whole quincunx is one. There's the pastoral, there's the romance, there's the mystery, and you're working with, very specifically in all these different genres. And I wonder, how you think of those, the lines on the field versus the rules of the game in the way that you approach your writing, as containment versus, the sort of generative aspect of form.
So one of the things that Harry said, because I think he found the whole obsession with the notion of constraining, and he preferred to think of it as obligations as well, that rather than you can't do this, this is what you do. And in some ways it's like what you just said about the rules. There is something really liberating about having those rules, I guess. But for genre, and why I chose 5 different genres of those books, was that it suddenly occurred to me that and again, it was around the notion of God, because the quincunx is, the ultimate godly organization and whatnot. But it occurred to me that when you see the word God in a detective story, it is illuminated differently than when you see it in a romance, or when you see it in a murder mystery, or when you see it in, whatever the genres are. And it was fascinating to me that you could take a still concept, let's say the concept of God, or let's say the concept of bread, and have it in the different genres, and those genres would themselves illuminate the idea or the thing differently, simply because of the setting. And so in some ways the settings are doing a kind of thinking about the objects that are placed within it. That's fascinating to me.
Yeah, I love that. And just brief thought about my own work and my own engagement with the notion of constraint. And I like this idea of obligation very much. I early on read the Oulipo Compendium when it came out, it's a wonderful sort of, for those of you not familiar with the movement, gives a kind of overview with lots of examples. And I was reading the Oulipo Compendium, and I was reading, going back to the beginning of the conversation, Gertrude Stein's the autobiography of Alice B. Toklas, and then reading some mystery novels. And I got the idea that I would write a novel using the tiniest constraint, because I realized I wasn't going to be someone who worked well with a tremendous number of rules, but I just wanted to be touched by obligation or touched by constraint. And so my first novel was called The Impossibly, and it started, I was actually carrying the Oulipo Compendium, and I just did a little visual constraint. I said I'm going to start a novel. I was in Key Foods on Avenue A in the East Village in New York, and I said, I shut my eyes, spun around. You can do this in New York. No one pays any attention. And spun around and then opened them, and the first thing that my eyes lit on, that would be a central element in the work that I was then to write.
Nice.
And I had a couple of other sort of subsidiary, very tiny, just touched by this notion. And when I opened my eyes, it fell upon a child's stapler in a back-to-school display. And so the first line of the novel was, the first time we met, it was about a stapler, I think. And then it went from there. And so I was just touched and nudged by constraint and obligation. But to me, that was tremendously freeing, because I kept having to check back in with that, just ever so slightly and organically as it went along.
Which is one of the, again, this is like an homage to Harry Matthews. He said that when you're doing these things, your obligations, the rules, what happens is that as you're writing, you're paying so much attention to not use the letter E, or to make sure that you mention this in the right time, that the deeper emotions come in while you're unaware. That all of a sudden, when you finished writing this thing that you believe to be about the rules, it actually tends to be about something much deeper, and of which you were unaware. And so rather than being a way of keeping yourself out of the work, it's secretly a way of sinking deeper into it, unconsciously.
Yeah. That's a question. One last question.
Sure.
What you've been talking about, the underlying structure, obligation, rules, can you spell that word?
She's got a mic.
Can you spell what that word is?
Oh, Oulipo? Yeah, it's Ouvroir de littérature potentielle, and it's the two letters of ouvroir, which is workshop, littérature, literature, and potentielle, potentially. So Oulipo. Yeah.
Okay, great, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.